From I find that predicting who will survive the season requires looking past the visceral horror of the nocturnal creatures and examining the environment itself as a living, breathing antagonist. The town in From does not operate on the standard survival horror rules that govern most media. In a typical horror narrative, the slowest, least resourceful, or most morally compromised characters are picked off sequentially, allowing the strongest to emerge victorious. However, the narrative logic of From dictates that the town is a reactive, almost algorithmic entity. It does not simply want the residents dead, it wants them marinating in despair. The creatures, with their frozen, horrifying smiles and slow, deliberate gaits, are merely the blunt instruments of a much larger, more insidious intelligence. They are not hunting for sustenance, they are hunting for maximum emotional devastation. If we reverse engineer this sadistic logic, we can predict who is on the chopping block by asking one fundamental question: whose death will inflict the highest psychological toll on the most vital survivors? The internal architecture of the town is built entirely on the concept of retaliation and emotional harvesting. Anytime the residents synthesize a genuine drop of hope, the environment counters with disproportionate trauma to crush that momentum. When Jim Matthews and Jade Herrera built the radio tower on the roof of Colony House, believing they could finally pierce the veil of their isolation and contact the outside world, the town summoned a freak storm to physically and symbolically destroy their efforts. When Tabitha Matthews dug beneath the houses to uncover the truth about where the monsters sleep, the ground literally swallowed her home. When Sheriff Boyd Stevens shouted his defiant refusal to be broken into the echoing woods, the town responded not by killing him directly, but by orchestrating the protracted, agonizing death of Tianchen Liu. It targeted the most innocent, beloved, and maternal anchor of the community simply to prove a devastating point about who is truly in control. The town operates as an emotional vampire, and the residents are merely its livestock, kept alive only long enough to produce the richest vintage of suffering. Currently, the cyclical nature of this torment is becoming dangerously unstable, and the established rules of Fromville are fraying at the edges. Characters are beginning to defy their assigned, passive roles. Boyd is smashing through metaphorical and literal walls instead of accepting the boundaries drawn for him, while Tabitha has seemingly fractured the illusion of absolute containment. The introduction of new, more calculated threats indicates that the entities governing this realm are abandoning their simple, window-tapping tactics of the past. They are strategizing, sabotaging, and setting psychological traps. The cicadas, the music box, the shifting seasons, and the rotting of the food supply are all symptoms of an environment that is mutating to address the rising resilience of its captives. In a shifting ecosystem like this, characters die when they meet one of two criteria: they become the precise emotional leverage needed to break a central leader, or their character arc has reached a fatal thematic resolution. The town is a merciless storyteller, and it knows exactly when a character has outlived their usefulness as a beacon of hope and must be repurposed as a monument to despair. Applying this framework, the first and perhaps most devastating loss we can anticipate is Donna Raines. Donna is the beating heart and the iron fist of Colony House. For seasons, she has been the immovable object standing between the residents and total anarchy. But in the logic of a closed-loop horror narrative, the safety net eventually has to be cut. The town feeds on fear, and the residents rely heavily on Donna's pragmatic, unshakable facade to stave off their own panic. By removing Donna, the town does not just eliminate a single threat, it fractures the entire social structure of Colony House. Without her to guide them, to ration their supplies, and to forcefully mediate their disputes, the residents will be ruled entirely by paranoia. Taking her off the board is the fastest way for the town to divide and conquer a group that has grown too unified. Furthermore, Donna has survived impossible odds, but her physical and mental deterioration is a ticking clock. She represents the old guard of survival, a system of simply enduring rather than escaping. As the narrative pushes the townspeople toward actively fighting back, Donna's philosophy of containment is becoming obsolete. The town will likely recognize this shift and eliminate her to force the residents out of their complacent misery and into acute, unmanageable terror. Her death would be a seismic event, leaving characters like Fatima, Ellis, and the newer arrivals completely unmoored and vulnerable to the town's manipulations. Speaking of Ellis, Boyd's son represents the ultimate leverage in the town's psychological warfare. Boyd Stevens operates on sheer force of will, driven by military discipline and his desperate, all-consuming need to protect his family and his people. The town has tried to break Boyd through physical torture, terrifying hallucinations, the infection of the bloodworms, and the brutal murder of his closest allies. Nothing has permanently extinguished his defiance. Therefore, to break a man who refuses to be broken, the town must attack his legacy. Ellis is positioned directly in the blast radius of the town's cruelty, especially with Fatima experiencing a deeply unnatural, horrific pregnancy. The town loves generational trauma, and if it wants to shatter Boyd's resolve permanently, taking his son away right as Ellis is about to become a father himself offers a cruel, poetic symmetry. Ellis has in many ways already fulfilled his narrative purpose. He reconciled with his estranged father, healing the wound left by his mother's tragic death. He found love in the darkest places on Earth and married Fatima in a defiant celebration of life. In prestige horror television, achieving internal peace usually means your number is up. If Ellis dies trying to protect Fatima or his unborn, presumably monstrous child, it would fundamentally destroy Boyd, stripping away the last remaining tether holding the sheriff's sanity intact. Another resident whose narrative trajectory points toward an inevitable demise is Sarah Myers. Sarah is the show's wild card, a tragic figure who committed unspeakable acts because she believed the voices telling her it was the only way to save everyone from the nightmare. She has been seeking redemption ever since she returned from the woods, but Fromville is not a place that grants absolution easily. Sarah understands the frequency of the town better than almost anyone. She can hear its whispers, making her both an invaluable asset and a massive, unpredictable liability. The show has been heavily foreshadowing the concept of a necessary sacrifice, playing with the idea that the scales of this universe must be balanced with blood. Sarah is desperately looking for a way to clear her ledger, to make amends for the innocent lives she took, particularly the death of Kenny's father. The narrative logic demands that her redemption cannot be achieved through mere survival or quiet apologies, it can only be bought with a grand sacrificial act. I theorize that Sarah will die throwing herself in front of a major threat, perhaps intercepting a fatal blow meant for Ethan Matthews' Julie or even Boyd. It is the only narrative conclusion that respects the gravity of her early crimes while simultaneously completing her arc from a manipulated pawn to an autonomous savior. Her death would provide closure for Kenny and force the town to acknowledge the impossible moral compromises the environment forces upon them. We must also consider the tragic arrival of Henry Kavanagh, Victor's father. Henry spent 40 years mourning the inexplicable disappearance of his wife and children, only to finally arrive in the nightmare himself after a lifetime of grief. While his presence provides a fascinating, heartbreaking look into the outside world's collateral damage, his survival directly conflicts with Victor's tragic trajectory. The show rarely allows a character to reclaim their lost past without exacting a violent, permanent cost. Victor has survived for decades by repressing his trauma, hiding in the margins, and adapting to the town's twisted, childlike rules. Henry represents a tether to the real world, a tether the town will inevitably sever. Henry's desperate belief in the logic of the outside world makes him uniquely vulnerable to the town's manipulations. The cruelty of Fromville is absolute. It would not reunite Victor with his father just to let them live happily ever after. The reunion is merely the setup for a much more devastating punchline. Henry is likely to be targeted to serve as the final crushing blow to Victor's fragile psyche. I suspect the town will use Henry's lack of understanding against him, leading to a situation where Victor is forced to witness his father's death, or worse, is unable to save him. Henry's death will force Victor to finally unearth his deeply buried memories of the town's origins without the safety of a paternal protector, pushing the oldest resident of Fromville into a new, darker phase of his existence. Jim Matthews also sits precariously on the edge of the narrative chopping block. Jim is an engineer, a man defined by his need to fix things, to build structures, and to impose logic onto chaotic situations. He is the embodiment of the modern, rational man trying to assert dominance over the supernatural. This mindset is fundamentally incompatible with the reality of Fromville. Jim's obsession with the radio tower, his paranoia regarding the voices on the other end, and his relentless pursuit of answers have consistently put his family and the wider community in danger. With Tabitha seemingly operating on an entirely different plane of reality, Jim's role as the patriarch is severely destabilized. He is prone to rash, desperate actions born out of frustration and a perceived loss of control. The town targets hubris, and Jim is incredibly hubristic in his belief that he can outsmart an ancient malevolent force. If the narrative requires a significant shift in the Matthews family dynamic, killing Jim would force Julie and Ethan to adapt rapidly, stripping them of their parental shield. It would also serve as a grim warning to characters like Jade, who also attempt to apply earthly logic to an unearthly nightmare. Jim's need to be the hero, to construct the ultimate escape plan, is precisely the kind of ambition the town delights in destroying. Moving toward the medical clinic, the dynamic between Christy and Marielle presents another ripe opportunity for the town's cruelty. Christy has been the undisputed bedrock of medical and emotional support for the town, a stoic professional who sacrificed her own happiness to keep strangers breathing. The arrival of her fiancée, Marielle, felt like a miraculous gift, but in Fromville, gifts are always Trojan horses. Marielle's struggle with addiction and the withdrawal she experienced upon arriving made her an immediate liability, but it also tethered Christy to a profound emotional vulnerability. The town knows that Christy can handle trauma, she has amputated limbs, and pronounced friends dead without breaking. But watching the woman she loves succumb to the supernatural horrors of the town might be the one thing that shatters her. If we follow the logic that the town seeks to dismantle the community support systems, eliminating Marielle would devastate Christy, potentially compromising the town's only reliable medical provider. Conversely, if Christy were to perish to save Marielle, it would leave Marielle racked with insurmountable survivor's guilt, trapped in a nightmare world without her anchor, and leave the entire town medically defenseless. Given the show's penchant for punishing pure love, the survival of both women seems statistically impossible within the show's established framework. Then there is Kenny Liu, the eternal deputy and the heart of the sheriff's station. Kenny has suffered immensely, losing both his father and his mother to the town's sadistic games. He has stepped up as a leader, acting as Boyd's conscience and the moral compass for the younger residents. However, Kenny's arc is reaching a perilous saturation point of grief. There is only so much trauma a character can absorb before they either break completely or transcend their fear. Kenny's recent losses have hardened him, replacing his initial anxiety with a cold, desperate anger. The danger for Kenny lies in his willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good, a trait he shares with Boyd. However, unlike Boyd, who the town wants to keep alive to suffer, Kenny might be viewed as an expendable piece on the board. If the town senses that Kenny is on the verge of unifying the younger generation or figuring out a crucial piece of the puzzle regarding the dreams and the cicadas, it will swiftly remove him. His death would be a catastrophic blow to morale, proving that goodness, loyalty, and sheer endurance are not enough to guarantee survival. When we synthesize all these trajectories, a terrifying picture emerges of a town that is constantly eating its own tail, an Ouroboros of suffering that adjusts its tactics to the resistance of its prisoners. The monsters in the woods, the terrifying visions, the temporal anomalies. These are all just the immune system of a much larger organism, attacking anything that threatens the status quo of misery. The characters who will not make it to the end of the season are not the weak, they are the structurally vital. They are the emotional load-bearing pillars of the community. To collapse a building, you do not chip away at the paint, you dynamite the foundation. Therefore, characters like Donna, Ellis, Sarah, Henry, and Jim are in grave danger not because they have failed to survive, but because they have succeeded too well. Their bonds, their love, and their redemptive arcs have made them too valuable. In the dark, twisted logic of from hope is not a weapon against the darkness, hope is the bait. As the season progresses and the residents inch closer to understanding the true nature of their prison, the town will strike back with surgical precision. It will not aim for body counts, it will aim for broken hearts, it will systematically dismantle their leadership, corrupt their safe havens, and execute their loved ones in a desperate bid to maintain control. The endgame of Fromville is not death. Death is merely the tool used to ensure that those left behind understand the absolute futility of fighting back, and the characters who fall will be the ones whose absence casts the longest, darkest shadows over those who remain.